after spending the day together and hearing about research in Indigenous communities related to autism or related in just working with Indigenous communities, if anybody at the table or online wants to share any of their response to question 1 about what your research might be what research might be of interest to you at this moment.
What I'm interested in, our table, sorry, making it all about me. When we were talking about this and thinking about HELP and the EDI and the data that's available and so forth. So I would be interested, or we would be interested in knowing what is the impact of that and how has the data been used to influence positive outcomes or lifting vulnerabilities in communities, in particular Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. I don't
know if you can answer that, but it was just a question.
I do have a couple of examples. I have worked with MCFD a number of years ago one of our nations really wanted an AIDP, but didn't have any funding. There was no funding coming out, but there was some funding available in this particular area. And so she used the EDI data for that particular area as one of her resources and used that strongly to make a case. And we did get a very well-funded AIDP program in that nation. And I do know a couple of other instances where AIDP programs have used the EDI data to strengthen their position or their stance in maintaining and keeping their funding. And it may not be making a difference so much at the level of the family, but it's made a difference in the resource itself, feeling safe that funding isn't going to disappear because they use the vulnerability in that particular community. So we've had some positive work with the ministry as using it as part of their reasoning for funding our programs.
One thing our table talked about was that no matter where you are in the province, the funding is the same, but the costs to access services vary greatly. And that there's, for professionals that work in remote communities, there's extra funding, for isolation pay and whatnot, and maybe the autism funding could look at a similar model.
That is a solution that has been offered over the years to address the inequities for people living in rural communities, whether Indigenous or not. And also, of course, when you have a child who's extremely high needs or a family who is impoverished, all the, receiving $22,000 a year if you live if you have a good income and are well educated in Vancouver is not equal to living in a very small community without any of those benefits. So the BC program has advantages in that every family gets the funding. But we also worry about the families who have nothing to spend it on. Do they actually, in their communities, how much are they actually engaging? And does it just add to their guilt that they can't find anything locally? So it's something that has been brought up, but we haven't seen any solutions to it. Are there any more questions? Any more suggestions?
Or anything online about things that might help?
No, I haven't seen anything recently. I guess one thing that, just a very small point of information, Grace, and maybe you could answer this. One of the people online asked the question, what's the difference? Like, why use the stat? And you should spell out what stat means because my brain can't remember it. What's the difference between that and the MChat, between the stat and the MChat?
So they're both screening tools for autism, and they were developed by different people, but essentially they do very similar things. The MChat, however, is a kind of quick and dirty, in the doctor's office or a nurse or someone. It's kind of like more of a checklist or a quick interview with the parent or caregiver, whereas the stat is screening tool for autism in toddlers, right.
Autism.
So it's designed so that it's happening in a play context, so it's more interactive. And so you're actually playing with, it's ideal for like a daycare center, right? Or a place where children are playing, they're with other children, and there are daycare workers there who often do those things anyway. So it's a lot of play, interactive play. And that's how you assess. So there are particular toys that come with the screening tool, which is why, the toys themselves could, and we talked to Wendy, the developer of the tool, they could be more culturally appropriate, and that wouldn't affect the screening itself. And it also, what the nice thing about the stat is that not only is it screening for developmental delays and autism symptoms per se, but it also allows the person who's doing the screening to then coach or give some feedback to the caregivers about what they could be doing as they wait maybe for more formal diagnosis. Because you can see, as you interact with the child, what are some of their strengths and what are some of their challenges, and then you could provide some feedback to the parents. Whereas if you have a checklist, you're not really seeing what the child is doing, and you're not really having a really good interaction with the parent or any of those things, right? It's more just checking boxes. Whereas the stat is more of a live, interactive, engaging kind of tool. And it's not that intimidating, right? It's really what the workers are already doing. They just a little bit more structured.
Something that I've been talking to a few people about recently, we had a provincial meeting last week with ASCD and AIDP and various service folks, and we started talking about the challenges of getting the proper, I don't know if the word's proper, but getting the required autism services into really remote and rural communities where it's really hard to access behavioral consultants and even behavioral interventionists. And so we're finding families are really struggling around this and then forfeiting their money. And I just had a parent come to me recently who was in this situation. And, so we were chatting last week around the idea that perhaps maybe we need to, instead of trying to do things the same way when it isn't working, how can we start to change that system so it better meets the needs of our kids and families instead of forcing them into this box, which just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And maybe look at some other ways of getting those funds into the communities where they're better managed right at the local level. And that those the behavioral consultant really is developing a plan. As a stranger coming in, doesn't know the child or family, usually they jets it in, have to learn really quickly a bit about, the child and family, write something up, then they're off again. You think, wow, well, there's probably folks right in the community, the early child development team or, other folks that are already in the community that could perhaps, Head Start folks or ASCD, AIDP folks that could help put together a plan and then help activate it. Perhaps if funds were injected right into the local programs that are already there, and a staff person or a staff person and a half could be hired just to focus on some of those kids with autism. I'm starting to think maybe we would have better results, and the dollars would be better used. You get those early interventions going. We know that the earlier the better. We know all that, right? So it's like, how do we do this in a better way instead of trying to, continue to figure out how do we get a really expensive behavioral consultant into, I was just talking to somebody at lunch about a flying community that has 2 kids under the age of 6 that can't access any services through the existing model. And so we really have to, I think, start thinking around doing it differently. And my hope is that the policy and funding people will consider that, maybe even pilot a few, in a few different regions and just see how it goes. So that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Piggyback on that. We spend so much, what might help is we spend so much time, especially around autism funding, on putting all of the focus on the child. Let's change the child. The intervention is for the child. It's about the child. Let's get him a BI. Let's get him a SLP. Let's change the child. And we need to focus more on the community and the support system around the child. If we could start to move, and this example actually came from another province. It didn't come from Canada, from British Columbia, but a parent who was an Indigenous said that they wanted to have some funding, not to be able to have a therapy for their child. They wanted the funding so that they could train people in their community to know how to interact and support their child. And so it was about, how can I use that funding for that? And so we're in a system right now where it's the money's attached to the kid and the kid's attached to the SLP or the OT or the BA or the, whatever it may be. But I think what could help in this sort of system that we're talking about is figuring out, having research around, what are all the other things that are involved that improve outcomes of children. And it's not just the direct one-to-one intervention, but if we have some answers to these broader questions of training community, which then has the result of creating better outcomes. And you're not flying people in because they're part of the community. That's where community. And so I think something like that. But then policies need to change and saying, you can use your funding for additional things. So
I think as we close up, I want to say one more thing, and it kind of fits with the whole day, and it kind of fits with the declaration, UNDRIP, and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. We just had National Child Rights Day on the 20th, and I happen to always carry around the book with me. I do. I carry every single time. I have these 3 books in my briefcase all the time. So the Convention of the Rights of the Child, just to summarize everything that we've talked about today, is we're talking about research, but we're talking about children and families living with autism. So the best part I like about the Convention of the Rights of the Child is in the preamble, and it says that it's convinced that the family as the fundamental group of society and the natural environment of the growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance. Those 2 words are important to me, so that it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community. And recognizing the child for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And I heard that from Ramona when she was talking about her piece, happiness and love and understanding. So it's there. What we're doing, there are things in place that were founded by research and that can add quality to our work and how we do our work. So just reminding ourselves of things that exist, and they fit together, because now I could read one from here that complements this. I could read one here that's calling us to do this. So I just wanted to end my sharing today on that.